Censorship has become all too common on college campuses. Leftist academics, faculty, and even students have become increasingly committed to silencing and suppressing dissenting points of view. For years now, we have seen things like transgender ideology, critical race theory, and political slander against conservatives find a comfortable home in the halls of academia, which raises an important question. Is this really just an attack on free speech, or is it the implementation of a new standard? Here to help us answer this question today is none other than Michael Knowles. Michael Knowles is host of The Michael Knowles Show at the Daily Wire, the book club at PragerU, and Verdict with Senator Ted Cruz. He is also author of the brand new book, Speechless, Controlling Words, Controlling Minds, which is available now for order on Amazon and in bookstores across the nation. Go pick up a copy. It will leave you speechless, which conveniently enough is the title of the book and the center of our discussion today. So, Michael, thank you so much for joining us, and congratulations, by the way, on writing a book with words.
Thank you very much. I spent about the same amount of time researching both books. Frankly, I spent longer researching reasons to vote for Democrats. It took my whole life to research. This one took somewhat longer to write. Both have extensive bibliographies, and I think both say important things about a similar topic.
Yes, both very profound pieces of work. I have your book right here. I read it cover to cover, and I've got to say, talking about your last book, it took me a little bit longer to read than your previous masterpiece.
You'll please pardon the prolixity. If brevity is the soul of wit, then clearly I've really underperformed on this new 350-page book.
Oh, certainly not. I think it's fantastic, and so far, everyone that I've talked to has loved it as well. Speechless, Controlling Words, Controlling Minds, that is the topic of today's discussion. In the book, you discuss how political correctness has been weaponized against Americans, conservatives in particular, to keep control of a narrative and ultimately control of a culture. Whoever controls the narrative will control the culture. You write that in the 80s and 90s, we saw debates over the language begin to take root. So where did this hyper-policing of speech come from, and how has it taken root in our classrooms and on our college campuses?
Well, it goes back further than we usually think. We usually think this begins in the 80s or 90s, as you say. Some people believe it goes back further to the 70s or the 60s. I think, and I argue in the book, it goes back to around the 1920s, and I trace the intellectual movements that brought us to where we are. And crucially, I take seriously the leftist intellectuals who developed this thing, because contrary to conservative self-flattery, I think that the left actually understands free speech and censorship much better than we do. I think that's why they've been able to manipulate language so well to their own political advantage. So it begins in the 20s, it really takes shape in the 70s, and then launches into the public sphere in the 80s and 90s. And there's this strange fact that although we've been fighting against political correctness since that time, we only ever seem to lose ground. And there are two competing strategies on PC, or let me say two reactions that conservatives tend to have, and both of them, I think, end up advancing political correctness. PC, I believe, is a purely negative campaign to destroy society's traditional standards. I do not believe, as many people do, that it is a debate between free speech on the one hand and censorship on the other. Rather, I think it's a battle between two competing sets of standards, the traditional standards and then the anti-standard of the left, just trying to destroy all of the traditional standards. So this lays a trap for conservatives, because on the one hand, you've got the squishes. They just kind of go along with the new standards. They call Bruce Jenner she or whatever. Yeah. Obviously, that advances political correctness. But then on the other hand, you've got the more stalwart conservatives who will say, no, I'm not going to go along with the new standard. But in so doing, they abandon standards altogether. They might call themselves free speech absolutists, say. They'll say, you can say whatever you want, do whatever you want, just don't raise my taxes or step onto my property, something like that. Either way, though, the traditional standards are abandoned. So you're giving the left exactly what it wants. And so, ironically, sometimes it seems the harder we fight against political correctness, the more ground we lose.
Exactly. Yeah. And that is kind of the dichotomy, is you have all these different approaches to it. You have the kind of libertarian side that says, as long as it's the government staying out of it, I don't care, do whatever you want. You have the principled conservatives such as yourself who say, no, it's actually more than that. I don't care who it is that's trampling my liberties, whether it's government or big tech. And when we talk about who's doing the censoring, it seems that big tech has essentially become our new government. Companies like Facebook, Twitter, and Google, they have a monopoly on our public discourse, and they have the power to censor the duly elected president in the blink of an eye. We saw that with President Trump. We often hear, you started to touch on this, that these are private companies and the government should stay completely out of their affairs. But you've been a strong voice and a consistent voice for conservatives who disagree with that sentiment and say, no, it's bigger than that. So, Michael, what is the answer to winning the big tech battle?
Build your own Twitter, right? No, I don't think so. This is what we've heard from people for years and years who believe that the only threat to our liberties and way of life is from big government. I think you've said it beautifully. I don't want my rights and my traditions taken away by some oligarch hipster Rasputin in Silicon Valley any more than if it were by some government bureaucrat. Mitch McConnell the other day said that these woke corporations are often acting as a sort of parallel government. Google, Facebook, and Twitter control 90% of speech, the flow of information around the internet, which is our public square. If you control speech in a democratic republic, you control politics. Speech is politics in a republic. We persuade one another, we debate things, we deliberate, and then we pass laws and figure out how we want to get along living together. Also, as a practical matter, they won't let us build our own Twitter. We tried to build our own Twitter. It was called Parler. They kicked it out of the App Store, which controls effectively the entirety of the smartphone market. Then, for those few people who were able to go on their desktops and still keep parlaying, what happened? Amazon Web Services kicked them off of their web service. So what are they telling us now? Build your own internet, build your own society, build your own government. I guess that's what we're trying to do. What we really need to do is assert our political rights. If a handful of oligarch billionaire leftists can control speech and even censor the duly elected sitting president of the United States, as they did on January 7th and 8th, that is a political problem. There is nothing illegitimate about using political power to stop that. And I don't think there's anything dignified about permitting those woke oligarchs to do it. There has been a faction of conservatives. I call them the losers with dignity, but they don't have any dignity, ironically. But all they ever seem interested in doing is quote unquote losing with dignity, and as acting as the court jesters in the kingdom of liberalism, offering limp, impotent opposition or the appearance of opposition to legitimize the dominant liberal regime. And so it's no surprise that we've lost and lost and lost. I think we need to assert a much more authentic political vision, not this narrow, desiccated understanding of politics that's crept up over the last 15, 20 years. We need to offer a substantive vision of politics, not merely a defense of free speech in the abstract, but we actually need something to say, because free speech in the abstract doesn't mean anything if you don't have something to say.
Exactly. And I think one thing that you pointed out beautifully is that the right for so long has just made it about focused on policy and on tax cuts and things like that. And they haven't actually focused on the culture. And now, the culture has gone to hell and they're saying, oh, look at this. This is terrible. And it's like, we'll do something about it. And I think a lot of that has to do with the speech that we have allowed to take precedent. And when we talk about the classroom, what starts in the classroom spills out into the culture. For a long time, conservatives were just saying, oh, just wait until these kids get out into the real world, then they'll see. Well, the problem is they're creating the new real world. They are the next generation. So what we're learning now is that what they're carrying with them, we're seeing that manifest in real time. How do we save academia from the PC clutches so that we can begin to make progress in the culture again?
I'm going to teach you a very important word. I'm sure you already know this word, but all too many conservatives do not. It's a magical little word, one syllable, two letters. No. Say no. You can say, we don't have to say yes to everything. We can say no. There was a very, very silly article in the New York Times that just came out defending critical race theory in classrooms by a former conservative or two, and then a bunch of liberals. And I think there were something like 4 or 5 authors on this column. They probably each wrote about 6 words. And the argument was that it is un-American to kick critical race theory out of a fifth grade classroom. It threatens academic freedom. You know that famous free marketplace of ideas, the kindergarten. That's where we discover all of our important discoveries.
Yeah.
I will take you back in time. I enter into my time machine, young man. I will take you back to the way, way back of 1952, when William F. Buckley Jr. was founding the post-war conservative movement. He did so before he had National Review. He had a book called God and Man at Yale. Everyone remembers the title if you're in conservative politics. Very few people remember the subtitle, which is The Superstitions of Academic Freedom. Bill Buckley launched not only his career, but the conservative movement by making fun of academic freedom, which he put in quotes. He called it a hoax. Yep. He insisted it was a farce. It's just a silly sleight of rhetoric that the left uses to destroy traditional standards in academia. You'll notice academic freedom only ever goes one way. It's only ever to let a bunch of communists in to teach a bunch of nonsense. In the book, Buckley points out it's being used to justify atheism and collectivism in the classrooms. But we don't really defend academic freedom. We don't think every idea should be taught in the classroom. For instance, Yale would never, and this is Buckley's example, Yale would never hire a neo-Nazi to teach sociology and lecture on the superiority of the Aryan man, nor should it. That would violate the university's mission. The truth is arrogant, right? The truth makes certain claims, and false things should not be taught. We should teach good things. Bad things should not be cultivated. Vices should not be cultivated. Liberal education requires limits. The whole point of it is that you've got to tamp down your ignorance and your base appetites and cultivate your higher virtues. You can't expand the curricula indefinitely. There are only so many weeks in a semester. There are only so many books you can possibly read. And yet today, how many conservatives do you know who defend academic freedom? We need to let the communists on campus. Academic freedom. We need critical race theory in schools. It's a trap. It's the same, and this trap is particularly funny because the conservative movement was founded directly in opposition to this. But we do it on free speech. We do it on all of these sorts of issues. And I think, as George Orwell warns in Politics in the English Language, we need to beware these cliches that just enter our minds, these little ready-made expressions of free speech, academic freedom, that's not who we are, that's whatever, all these sorts of silly ideas. And think about, what are we really talking about? Is a student's education really improved by teaching critical race theory, which in part denies objective reality? If you really take these ideas to their conclusion, is an education improved by denying truth and reality? I don't think so. I think actually education requires there to be truth and reality that you can come to know. And so I think conservatives need to embrace limits and recognize the battle between free speech and censorship. That's an illusory battle. That is a fictional battle. The real debate is between competing standards, and we need to be able to articulate some.
2 + 2 = 4. Therefore, 2 + 2 does not equal 5. These are the limits that we have in our classrooms. We necessarily do limit certain things because certain things are not true, and we allow certain things because certain things are true. So it goes, like you said, it does go back to a standard of objective reality or subjectivism. But when we talk about conservative students on campus, in chapter 9 of your book, you write that university campuses gave birth to political correctness, and it has just been bred on campus for several decades now. A lot of conservative students, Michael, do not feel comfortable to speak out for their beliefs. I know plenty of people who have had to drop out of school because of death threats. I know people who have been, shunned and booted from the polite society on campus, call it polite if you want. Yeah. They have been totally disregarded and left out to dry because when they speak out, that's the consequence that they have to pay. So what is your single biggest piece of advice you have for the college student who's scared to speak out against the 1619 Project, against critical race theory, against censorship, and a number of other issues? They just, like I said, self-censor to avoid those consequences. So what should they do in the midst of that backlash?
I would not recommend self-censoring. You don't need to be flamboyant and wear your MAGA hat every day to class, but I would not recommend self-censoring. I think integrity is a good thing to have, and you will get a lower grade, and you will not be invited to certain parties or to join certain clubs, and that's just the cost, but you'll sleep like a baby grinning ear to ear, so I would recommend it. Further, what I would say is, before you merely complain and say, this is outrageous that I'm being censored for saying perfectly ordinary things, before you say, this is cancel culture, this is censorship, take a breath and look at the situation. How was the left able to do this? This is what I try to outline in Speechless. Tamp down the anger for a second. It is unjust what's happening, but tamp down the righteous indignation and say, how were they able to do this? They were able to do this because all societies have limits, standards, and taboos. Every society has taboos. There are certain things in every society, going back to 1776, all the way up to the present, everywhere else on Earth. Before 1776, I should clarify as well, everywhere. You will be ostracized for saying certain things, and you will be encouraged to say other things. So what are we ostracized for? What are we encouraged to say? In the 1950s, you would be canceled for being a communist. But speaking of William F. Buckley Jr., his first book made fun of academic freedom. His second book defended Joe McCarthy, and now no conservative wants to talk about that. Buckley was defending McCarthy a dozen years later on national television, saying that he believes society should be more closed, that he is an epistemological optimist, saying, I mean, this is as mainstream a conservative as ever there was, and he's saying, no, there are limits. We actually don't need to defend the sacred rights of the communist or the Nazi, for that matter. There are always going to be limits. So in the 50s, you could be canceled and would be canceled for being a communist. In Hollywood, there was a blacklist. I think that was a very good thing. I know now many conservatives clutch their pearls and decry the Hollywood blacklist. But frankly, any conservative who says politics is downstream of culture and we need to retake the media is effectively calling for another blacklist, right? They're saying get the commies out of Hollywood so that we can produce good conservative content. Same thing in the academy. You could be prosecuted. I mean, there were Soviet agents and Communist Party members who were prosecuted under the Smith Act in the 1940s and 50s. And as well they should have been. Today, you will not be canceled for being a communist. You will be canceled for not being a communist. The fact of being canceled has not changed. It's the standard by which one is canceled. And I think this is an area where a lot of conservatives are too afraid to assert themselves because we've descended into a skepticism and a subjectivism that frankly is more radical even than that of our friends on the left or our opponents on the left. We refuse to say that some things are better than other things. I mean, there was a former conservative who still styles himself right-wing who actually said that drag queen story hour, toddlers twerking, or rather, I hope toddlers weren't twerking, though by the end of these things they probably are, drag queens, perverts, twerking for little kids in the public library is one of the blessings of liberty. The sound you can hear, by the way, is James Madison rolling over in his grave at that very thought.
Yeah.
And what, to be fair to this argument, what these people were saying is, if we tell perverts not to jiggle for 3-year-olds in public schools and libraries, why, they might tell us not to go to church on Sunday, which they're already doing and have been doing for a long time now.
So
practically, they did it for much of last year. And so practically it's a preposterous argument. But even, let's take the last year of lockdowns aside for a second. If you are really telling me that you just can't see the difference, you don't know, you have no idea how we can judge between a pervert jiggling for a kid and a pastor reading a homily or an exegesis. What you are telling me is you do not possess faculties of reason. You do not possess moral conscience. It's all just kind of like your opinion, man, to quote that great philosopher, the Big Lebowski. So if now we're saying that you don't possess those abilities of discernment, okay, you've just surrendered self-government, because self-government relies on your faculty of reason and your moral judgment. John Adams told us this, many other people have told us this, and these poor, misguided conservatives have just totally forgotten it over the last couple decades.
Yeah, and James Madison writes about that in Fed 55. What is government but the greatest reflection of all on human nature? So self-government is essential to drawing those distinctions. And I think...
And by the way, speaking of James Madison and the Federalist, I think a lot of these, both the squishes and the more stalwart types, both of whom advance PC, they focus on liberty. And frankly, I think they're misunderstanding liberty. I think they're conflating liberty and licentiousness, which our founding fathers said is a big no-no. But even beyond that, what does James Madison tell us in Federalist 51 about the end of government? He says, justice not liberty, justice is the end of government and will be pursued until liberty be lost. So liberty is a wonderful instrument, but justice is the point here. And justice means making discernments between and distinctions between good and bad and right and wrong and true and false, which our present atrophied, impotent conservatives refuse to do.
Yeah, I think the approach to liberty shouldn't be looked at through the lens of the right to just do whatever you want, but the right to do as you should do. And for conservatives on campus, I definitely think that it's time for them to step up and not be afraid to, as Winston Churchill would say, make enemies, because good, you stood up for something at some point in your life. Well, Michael, thank you so much for joining us today and talking to us about censorship on college campuses, talking to us about these standards. Everyone definitely needs to go pick up a copy of Speechless, Controlling Words, Controlling Minds. I didn't bring a bell with me, Michael. I should have brought one, so I apologize.
I must have one somewhere.
Yeah.
Let me see. No, maybe not. They've taken them away from me at this point.
Ding, ding. There we go. We got the bell. Michael Knowles, The Daily Wire, thank you so much for joining us.
Thanks for having me. Pleasure's all mine.